I am Thomas Barrett, 74 years old, and somehow still recovering from the deep, devastating wounds my own company and family inflicted upon me. As the Senior Vice President of Acquisitions at Nexus Holdings, I spent 4 decades building their commercial real estate empire, only to be cast aside the moment I outlived my usefulness. Just this morning I closed the biggest financial deal of my entire life, only to face the ultimate betrayal from the people I trusted most in this world. Before I continue this story, let me know exactly where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe right now if you have ever poured your blood, sweat, and tears into building something great, only to have to stand up to people who severely underestimated your worth and tried to destroy your legacy. The nightmare began in my corner office on the 42nd floor of our downtown Chicago headquarters. My tie was pulled loose, my chest felt incredibly tight, and my heart was hammering against my ribs in a frantic, exhausting rhythm. The sprawling city outside my window was still pitch black and completely asleep, but I had been wide awake for 3 straight days. My heavy wooden desk was a chaotic graveyard of empty coffee cups, cold takeout food, and scattered legal documents. For 72 grueling hours, I had been locked in a secure, high-stakes conference call with a powerful syndicate of real estate moguls in Tokyo. We were hammering out the final agonizing clauses of a massive commercial port acquisition. $256 million were on the line. It was the largest single deal in the entire history of our firm, and its success rested entirely on my shoulders. I was the only executive in the building who had the decades of personal history and deep mutual respect with the Japanese businessmen. They trusted me implicitly. They absolutely did not trust our arrogant 38-year-old Chief Executive Officer Maxwell Thorne. At exactly 5 in the morning, the lead investor in Tokyo finally gave his verbal agreement. The digital ink dried on the screen in front of me. The massive funds were officially authorized for immediate transfer. I let out a long, shaky breath that I felt like I had been holding for the last 3 days. I had actually done it. I had secured the financial future of the company, an empire I had helped build from the very ground up when Maxwell was still a child in grade school. I rubbed my aching eyes, feeling the heavy, undeniable exhaustion settle deep into my 74-year-old bones. But despite the terrible fatigue, I was smiling. I felt a profound, swelling sense of pride. I gathered my thick files, buttoned my suit jacket, and headed down the silent hall. Maxwell had called an emergency executive board meeting for 5 in the morning to confirm the closing of the deal. I walked down the long, dimly lit, carpeted corridor toward the main boardroom. I pushed open the heavy oak doors at exactly 5:05. I expected a standing ovation from my peers. I expected overwhelming relief. I expected a room full of colleagues ready to celebrate the climax of a grueling high-pressure marathon. Instead, I walked into an ice-cold, suffocating silence. 12 board members sat rigidly around the long mahogany table. Not a single one of them looked up at me. They stared down at their expensive legal pads, shifting uncomfortably in their plush leather chairs. At the head of the table sat Maxwell Thorne. He was wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit, his dark hair perfectly slicked back. He did not look like a man whose company had just been handed a $250 million lifeline. He looked at me with eyes so incredibly devoid of human emotion that they could have belonged to a reptile. I stood there in the doorway, suddenly acutely aware of the deafening silence in the room. I tried to offer a tired, genuine smile. I told them the deal was finally done. The commercial port was officially ours. Maxwell did not smile back. He slowly picked up a thick manila folder and slid it across the polished wood of the table. It stopped right at the edge, pointing directly at my chest. "You are 5 minutes late, Tom," he said. His voice was completely flat, echoing harshly in the large, quiet room. I let out a small, confused laugh. I told him I was late because I was on the phone with Tokyo, finalizing the massive corporate transfer. I told him we had just made history. This company runs on absolute precision. Maxwell continued, completely ignoring my words, as if I had not even spoken. "We do not tolerate indiscipline. We do not tolerate a lack of respect for corporate protocol. You are fired, Tom. Effective immediately for gross insubordination. I stared at him in pure disbelief. I genuinely thought it was a terrible, highly tasteless joke. But then I looked around at the board members. Not a single one of them raised their head to defend me. These were men and women. I had personally mentored people whose careers I had saved time and time again over the years. Now they were staring at the floor, absolutely terrified of the young CEO. Before I could even process the utter absurdity of what was happening, the heavy boardroom doors opened behind me. Two large security guards stepped into the room. I recognized them immediately. I was the one who had approved their hiring contracts a decade ago. They stepped up right beside me, their expressions totally blank and unfeeling. Maxwell stood up, casually buttoning his suit jacket. He looked down his nose at me with a look of pure disgust. "Because this is a disciplinary termination," he announced loudly to the room. "Company bylaws dictate that your multi-million-dollar pension and all of your unvested stock options are permanently frozen. Security will escort you to the exit now. You are not to return to your desk. Your personal items will be mailed to you. Your corporate phone and laptop are confiscated as of this exact moment." I could not breathe. My mind spun in a frantic, terrifying circle. A lifetime of unwavering loyalty completely erased in a matter of seconds. The security guards gently but firmly took hold of my arms. They guided me out of the boardroom, marched me down the elevator, and led me straight out the front doors of the building. They handed me a small, pathetic cardboard box containing just a few personal items from my desk that someone else had hastily packed. Then, the heavy glass doors clicked and locked securely behind me. I stood completely alone on the freezing Chicago sidewalk. The bitter wind bit through my thin dress shirt. It was 5:30 in the morning. The streetlights flickered weakly against the cold, gray pavement. I had just handed them a massive fortune, and they had thrown me out into the street like a stray dog. My hands shook violently as I reached into my coat pocket. They had taken my corporate phone, but I still had my personal cell phone. I desperately needed help. I needed someone to explain this absolute madness to me. I dialed the one person I knew would be just as outraged as I was. I called my son, Cameron. Cameron was the vice president of operations at the firm. He was supposed to be on that board. He must not have been in the room yet. He would know what to do. He would fix this terrible misunderstanding. I raised the phone to my ear, shivering uncontrollably in the cold wind, listening to the dial tone. It rang once. It rang twice. Then it went straight to voicemail. I lowered the phone from my ear, staring at the cracked screen as the automated voicemail recording played on a continuous loop. The freezing Chicago wind whipped through the towering skyscrapers, biting at my face and stinging my eyes. I hailed a passing cab, sinking into the worn back seat. The heater was broken, blowing air that did absolutely nothing to chase away the paralyzing chill settling in my bones. I stared out the dirty window at the waking city, my mind drifting back through the decades. 15 years ago, my beautiful wife Beatrice lost her brutal battle with cancer. I vividly remember holding her fragile hand in that sterile hospital room, making her one final, unbreakable promise. I promised her I would do whatever it took to give our only son the best possible life. I worked 80-hour weeks. I missed holidays and vacations. I sacrificed my own physical health to pay his exorbitant Ivy League tuition entirely in cash, ensuring he would never start his adult life suffocated by crippling financial debt. I personally walked him into the grand lobby of Nexus Holdings, cashing in decades of my own hard-earned corporate capital to secure him a coveted position as the vice president of operations. I built him a golden staircase directly to the top of the corporate world. Now, in the exact moment my entire career was violently dismantled, the boy I sacrificed my entire existence for could not even be bothered to answer his phone. The severe physical exhaustion of a 3-day negotiation finally crashed down on me, leaving a sour metallic taste in my mouth as the taxicab drove slowly away toward my empty, quiet suburban house. That evening, I sat alone in the dark living room of my modest two-bedroom home. The silence was death. Just before 7 o'clock, a sharp knock broke the quiet. I opened the front door to find Cameron standing on the porch, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit. Beside him stood his wife, Brooke, clutching an oversized designer handbag like a shield. I stepped aside, expecting my son to wrap his arms around me. I expected him to be utterly furious at Maxwell for the massive disrespect shown to his father. I expected him to say we were going to fight this blatant injustice together. Instead, Cameron walked into the living room and let out a long, heavy sigh. He did not look angry. He looked entirely inconvenienced. He refused to meet my eyes as he paced across the worn hardwood floor. "Dad, you need to calm down and listen to me," Cameron began, his voice slick and incredibly practiced. Maxwell sent out a mandatory schedule change email at exactly 4:30 in the morning. He moved the meeting up. "You completely missed it. You walked in late to the most important board meeting of the quarter." I stared at my son, trying to process the sheer absurdity of his statement. I told him I was on an active high-security call with Tokyo at 4:30. I told him the entire executive board knew I was closing the port acquisition. "You are 74 years old, Dad," Cameron interrupted, raising his hands in a defensive, patronizing gesture. "You are slowing down. You are missing crucial details. The corporate world moves fast, and Nexus Holdings needs a dynamic, youthful image to survive the upcoming market shifts. Missing a direct directive from the chief executive officer is gross insubordination. Maxwell had every legal right to terminate your contract." The room began to spin. My own son was reciting corporate human resources talking points to justify my sudden termination. I asked him how he could possibly defend a man who just froze my entire life savings and pension over a delayed email. Cameron finally stopped pacing. He looked at me with a cold, calculating expression that I had never seen on his face before. "Dad, do not make this a massive legal issue. Do not hire lawyers. Do not go to the press. If you try to sue Nexus Holdings, it will completely ruin my career. I am next in line for a major promotion. I cannot have my father dragging the company name through a messy public legal battle just because you refuse to accept that your time is simply up. You need to gracefully accept your retirement so we can all move forward." The betrayal hit me like a physical punch to the chest. He was not here to defend my honor or protect my livelihood. He was here to protect his own corporate ascent. I was perfectly willing to let me take the fall, to let me lose everything I had worked for just so he could keep his comfortable seat at Maxwell Thorne's table. Brooke stepped forward, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the floorboards. She looked around, my humble living room, visibly wrinkling her nose at the dated furniture and the faded floral wallpaper Beatrice had chosen 20 years ago. She crossed her arms, adopting a sickeningly sweet, condescending tone. "We are going to take good care of you, Tom," Brooke said, flashing a bright, entirely fake smile. "We know losing your pension is a difficult adjustment. Cameron and I talked it over on the drive here. We are willing to send you a $2,000 monthly allowance out of our own pockets to help cover your basic living expenses. You can stay in this quiet little house. All you have to do is sign the non-disclosure agreement. The company legal team is going to courier over tomorrow morning. Just sign the paperwork, hand over any remaining corporate files you might have, and quietly step away from the business. $2,000. My jaw tightened so hard my teeth ached. I had literally just handed their company a $256 million portfolio, and my daughter-in-law was offering me a microscopic allowance as if I were a helpless, pathetic charity case. They were trying to buy my total silence with pocket change. I looked back and forth between my son and his wife. The smooth, practiced nature of their visit suddenly felt entirely too scripted. I simply nodded my head quietly, masking the violent storm of realization brewing behind my eyes. I told them I understood and that I just needed some time to rest. They seemed visibly relieved by my lack of resistance, quickly saying their goodbyes and practically running out the front door. When the heavy wooden door finally clicked shut, the suffocating silence quickly returned to the empty room. But my racing mind was absolutely screaming. The basic logic and the financial math simply did not add up under any circumstances. A completely ruthless, profit-driven corporate entity does not instantly fire their top mega closer over an unread scheduling email at 4:30 in the morning. Furthermore, they certainly do not rush to strictly enforce an ironclad non-disclosure agreement unless they are desperately trying to hide something incredibly massive from the authorities. My sudden, humiliating termination was absolutely not a petty disciplinary action. It was a highly orchestrated, perfectly timed execution. The moment I realized the sequence of events was entirely fabricated, sleep became absolutely impossible. I sat alone in the pitch-black living room of my empty house, staring blankly at the wall as the early morning light slowly began to filter through the blinds. My mind, trained over 4 decades to dismantle complex financial contracts and spot hidden liabilities, began to clinically dissect Cameron's perfectly polished explanation. He claimed I was terminated because I missed a simple scheduling email sent at 4:30 in the morning. He claimed it was a spontaneous disciplinary action triggered by my supposed insubordination. But the timeline was fundamentally broken. The Corporate Information Technology Department does not operate on a whim. Revoking a senior executive's master access to the server network requires a multi-level authorization process that takes hours, sometimes even days, to fully execute across all global systems. Yet my badge was deactivated, and my digital access was completely wiped before I had even stepped foot inside that boardroom. Furthermore, the 2 security guards who escorted me out were standing by the doors, briefed and ready long before I had even committed the supposed offense of being exactly 5 minutes late. A termination of a senior vice president who just closed a $250 million international portfolio is never an accident. It requires meticulous premeditation. It requires careful legal structuring to freeze a pension of my size. Maxwell Thorne did not wake up at 4:30 in the morning, send a scheduling email, get angry that I did not respond while on a verified client call, and spontaneously decide to fire the most profitable executive in his entire organization. They wanted me out of that building immediately. They needed me completely locked out of the corporate server the exact moment the Tokyo acquisition became official. The chilling realization washed over me like a bucket of ice water. My own son was not just a passive bystander who was too cowardly to defend his father. Cameron was an active, willing participant in a highly coordinated strike to remove me from the very company I helped build. I needed to know exactly why he would willingly burn our relationship to the ground just to appease a young, arrogant chief executive. I had to find the real motive now. There was a much darker, terrible truth hidden right beneath his deceitful lies. By noon the next day, my restless pacing had turned into a burning need for concrete answers. I grabbed my car keys and drove out to the affluent gated community where Cameron and Brooke lived. I knew their daily routines perfectly. I parked my old sedan a full block away from their sprawling estate, carefully positioning myself behind a row of thick, evergreen shrubs so I would not be spotted. I rolled down the window just enough to hear the sounds of the neighborhood. I did not have to wait long. Less than 20 minutes later, a flatbed delivery truck slowly rolled up to their wide paved driveway. The driver carefully unloaded a pristine midnight black Porsche Panamera. I watched in stunned silence as Cameron walked out of his front door. He was smiling broadly, a look of pure triumph plastered across his face. He casually tossed a large cash tip to the delivery driver. As he reached out to grab the keys to his new luxury vehicle, the afternoon sun caught the heavy gleaming metal on his left wrist. Even from a distance, my experienced eyes recognized the distinct, intricate dial of a Patek Philippe watch. It was an elite, highly exclusive timepiece that easily cost upwards of $50,000. My chest tightened painfully. Cameron made a handsome salary as a vice president, but it was absolutely not the kind of money that allowed for impulse purchases of exotic sports cars and elite luxury watches on a random Tuesday afternoon. Just then, Brooke strutted out onto the front porch, holding her mobile phone pressed tightly to her ear. Her voice was loud, shrill, and completely devoid of any modesty. I could hear her bragging clearly through the crisp autumn air. "Yes, we are incredibly excited," she practically shouted to whoever was on the other end of the line. "Cameron just authorized the wire transfer this morning. $2.5 million straight cash deposit for the Hamptons estate. No, we did not even need a mortgage. It is going to be our perfect summer getaway. We are celebrating tonight." I sat perfectly still in the driver's seat of my cold car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned completely white. A $2.5 million cash down payment, a $50,000 watch, a new sports car. The horrifying pieces of the puzzle suddenly slammed together in my mind with sickening clarity. My son had not simply bowed to corporate pressure to protect his current job. He had been massively compensated. This sudden explosive display of extreme wealth was entirely too coincidental. Cameron and Brooke were celebrating a massive financial windfall that miraculously landed in their laps on the exact same morning my entire career was violently dismantled. My own flesh and blood had sold my livelihood for an exorbitant payout. The sheer scale of the betrayal threatened to completely suffocate me. I needed to secure my assets before they could strike again. I quickly started the engine and drove away from the pristine neighborhood, my mind racing with terrifying possibilities. If Cameron was willing to orchestrate my termination for a massive payout, there was absolutely no telling how far he would go to ensure I remained completely powerless. I drove directly to the main branch of my local bank downtown. I needed to access my safety deposit box immediately. It contained physical hard copies of all my original corporate employment contracts, sensitive legal documents, and emergency cash I had quietly set aside over the past 20 years. It was the only financial and legal leverage I had left in the world to fight back against a multi-billion-dollar corporation. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the bank and marched straight to the front desk. My hands were shaking slightly, but I maintained a calm exterior. I handed my identification to the teller behind the counter and asked for immediate access to my secure box. The teller typed my name into her computer system, her eyes scanning the screen. Suddenly, she frowned. She typed the information again, her brow furrowing in obvious confusion. "I am so sorry, Mr. Barrett," she said, looking up with an apologetic expression. "But you no longer have access to this box." I stared at her, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. I asked her to explain, stating clearly that my name was on the primary lease. "Yes, your name was on the lease," she replied slowly. "But the box was completely closed out and emptied this morning by the secondary authorized key holder. Your son Cameron came in 3 hours ago. He terminated the box and transferred the entire contents under his sole legal authority." I stood there entirely frozen in total disbelief. I asked the young teller to repeat herself, praying that my exhaustion had caused me to mishear her words. She looked at me with deep sympathy and gently turned her monitor so I could see the screen. The numbers were right there in stark black and white. The primary joint emergency savings account, the one I had opened with my son nearly a decade ago to secure our family against any unforeseen tragedy, had a current balance of absolutely zero. $400,000 in liquid cash had completely vanished. I asked her exactly what time the withdrawal was made. She checked the digital timestamps and informed me that Cameron had walked into this very branch at 8 in the morning, a mere 3 hours after I was escorted out of the Nexus Holdings building. He had utilized a standard estate management loophole presenting legal documentation that falsely claimed I was experiencing a severe cognitive decline, which granted him immediate administrative control to protect the assets. The sheer audacity of his actions left me struggling to pull air into my lungs. My own flesh and blood had systematically orchestrated my corporate execution, watched me walk away with nothing but a cardboard box, and then immediately drove to the bank to sever my final financial lifeline. He had left me utterly destitute. I did not have enough money left in my personal checking account to cover the next mortgage payment. I thanked the bank teller quietly, my voice devoid of emotion, and walked slowly out of the bank. The bright afternoon sun felt incredibly mocking as I stood alone on the pavement. Every instinct in my aging body screamed at me to drive straight back to his sprawling estate, kick down his front door, and demand to know why he had destroyed his father. But a cold, calculating logic quickly overpowered my burning rage. Confronting him now would be a massive tactical error. He had all the money, all the corporate power, and the full backing of a billionaire chief executive. If I showed up screaming on his doorstep, he would simply call the police, use my outburst to validate his false claims about my declining mental state, and have me permanently institutionalized. I needed to approach this betrayal not as a grieving father, but as a seasoned corporate predator preparing for war. I drove to the industrial outskirts of the city, far away from the glittering glass skyscrapers and manicured lawns of my previous life. I pulled my car into the cracked, uneven parking lot of a dingy, neon-lit diner that smelled faintly of stale coffee and fried food. It was the kind of place where corporate executives never ventured, making it the perfect location for a completely clandestine meeting. I walked into the dimly lit restaurant and slid into a sticky vinyl booth in the far back corner. A few minutes later, Mitchell Crawford walked through the front door. Mitchell was my oldest, most trusted friend and a notoriously ruthless former federal prosecutor who had spent his entire career dismantling corrupt Wall Street empires. He slid into the booth across from me, his sharp eyes immediately assessing my disheveled, exhausted appearance. I did not waste any time with pleasantries. I laid out every single agonizing detail of the last 48 hours. I told him about the massive $256 million port acquisition with the Tokyo Syndicate. I told him about the sudden 5 a.m. termination, the frozen pension, the highly suspicious early morning scheduling email, the brand new luxury car, and finally, the completely drained joint savings account. Mitchell listened in absolute silence, his face an unreadable mask of intense concentration. When I finally finished speaking, he pulled out a heavily encrypted laptop from his worn leather briefcase and opened it on the table between us. He began making a few discreet backdoor inquiries into his extensive network of financial informants. For 20 agonizing minutes, the only sound was the rapid, steady, rhythmic clicking of his keyboard. Then he stopped typing and looked up at me, his expression gravely serious. "Tom," he said, keeping his voice incredibly low, "your sudden termination was absolutely not a random act of corporate discipline. Nexus Holdings is quietly preparing to launch a massive initial public offering at the end of next month. They are taking the company public." I stared, my mind struggling to process the monumental implications of his discovery. An IPO of that immense magnitude required an anchor of absolute, unshakable financial stability to attract elite Wall Street investors. Mitchell turned his laptop screen toward me so I could clearly see the confidential financial filings he had just unearthed. "They are using your Tokyo deal as the sole foundational backing for the entire public offering," Mitchell explained, pointing to a highlighted section of the complex document. The sheer volume of that international acquisition artificially inflated their corporate valuation by nearly 300% overnight. Maxwell Thorne and your son are about to become instant billionaires the moment they ring that bell. But there is a massive discrepancy here. The numbers simply do not align. There is a truly vast amount of capital missing from the preliminary disclosures, and they needed you completely removed from the executive board before you could ever review the final audited ledger. I leaned slowly back against the worn vinyl booth, processing the enormous gravity of the situation. If Maxwell and Cameron were intentionally falsifying the initial public offering disclosures, they were actively committing federal securities fraud on an unprecedented, monumental scale. In order to truly understand exactly how they were stealing the money and where they were actively hiding it, we desperately needed unrestricted access to the raw, unedited digital ledger of the company. We needed the original source code of the Tokyo transaction before they could permanently scrub it from the central corporate servers. Mitchell sighed heavily, closing his encrypted laptop. Getting a formal federal subpoena for those highly secured digital files would take entirely too long. He warned me, his voice laced with genuine frustration. By the time a judge actually approves the official warrant, Maxwell and your son will have completely erased the digital money trail. They know exactly how the system works. They made absolutely sure to revoke your administrative network access before they fired you, leaving us completely blind and totally locked out of the massive mainframe. A slow, chilling smirk crept across my face as a brilliant realization suddenly struck me. My pulse quickened with the thrill of a newly formed tactical strategy. They did systematically lock out my digital account, I replied, my voice dropping to a dangerous conspiratorial whisper. They completely and permanently severed my remote connection to the modern cloud network. But those arrogant young executives completely forgot the history of the massive building they currently occupy. They forgot who actually laid the physical network cables in that concrete basement 25 years ago. I leaned closely across the small diner table, looking Mitchell dead in the eye. I know a physical, totally undocumented secret backdoor directly into their primary servers tonight. Mitchell leaned forward across the sticky diner table, his sharp eyes narrowing with a mixture of deep skepticism and intense curiosity. He asked me what on earth I was talking about. I took a sip of bitter coffee and explained the forgotten architectural history of Nexus Holdings. 25 years ago, before Maxwell Thorne inherited the company and transformed it into a corporate giant. The firm was just a mid-sized commercial real estate agency operating out of a 10-story brick building. When we originally bought the property to serve as our central headquarters, we lacked the budget to hire an external technology firm to wire our internal network. I was a much younger, significantly more agile man back then, and I personally spent 3 grueling weeks crawling through the dusty subterranean levels of that building. I physically laid thousands of feet of Category 5 network cables with my own 2 hands to connect the executive floors directly to the main server hub in the basement. When the company eventually exploded in size and they spent millions renovating the building into a modern glass skyscraper, they layered sophisticated biometric security protocols over the entire digital network. However, they completely failed to realize that the original physical infrastructure remained deeply embedded within the concrete foundation. I told Mitchell about a small, highly secure analog override panel that I had intentionally installed behind a reinforced section of drywall in sub-basement level 3. It was a fail-safe mechanism designed to bypass the main security grid in the event of a total systemic failure. Because the panel was entirely analog and hardwired directly into the primary server trunk, it was completely invisible to their modern digital monitoring software. Maxwell and his highly paid technology experts had absolutely no idea it even existed. Mitchell stared at me in stunned silence for a long moment, before a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. He reached into his leather briefcase, pulled out a specialized decryption laptop, and slid it across the table. He told me it was loaded with military-grade extraction software that would automatically download and decrypt the raw financial ledgers the absolute second it was plugged into an active network terminal. We formulated our infiltration strategy right there in the diner, meticulously planning every single move. At 2:00 in the morning, the freezing Chicago wind whipped through the empty streets of the financial district. I parked my sedan in a narrow alleyway 2 blocks away from the towering Nexus Holdings skyscraper. I took a deep breath, steadying my heart, and stepped into the biting cold. I was no longer dressed in my tailored executive suits. Instead, I wore a stained, heavy-duty canvas work jacket, thick steel-toed boots, and a faded yellow hard hat pulled low over my forehead. A worn leather tool belt hung heavily around my waist, completely concealing the slim decryption laptop tucked into the inner pocket of my coat. I carried a large, battered metal clipboard to complete the illusion. I marched confidently up to the heavily fortified rear loading dock of the building, projecting the absolute unquestionable authority of a thoroughly annoyed city utility worker. I pounded my heavy fist against the reinforced steel door until a young, visibly exhausted security guard finally buzzed me into the stark, brightly lit receiving bay. He took one look at my dirt-smeared clothing and asked me what I wanted at this ridiculous hour. I did not give him a single second to think or question my presence. I immediately launched into a loud, highly technical, and completely fabricated tirade about a critical pressure failure in the municipal steam lines running directly beneath the building. I told him the city boiler system was currently reading at critical mass, and if I did not get down into the sub-basement right this very second to manually release the main pressure valves, the entire block was going to experience a catastrophic pipe rupture. I shoved my metal clipboard aggressively toward his chest, demanding he sign the fabricated authorization forms, while simultaneously warning him that he would be held personally liable for millions of dollars in structural property damage if he delayed my inspection. The young guard, totally overwhelmed by my aggressive tone and the terrifying prospect of being blamed for a massive disaster, completely panicked. He did not bother to scan my face or verify my credentials through the corporate database. He simply swiped his master key card against the security scanner, the heavy metal turnstile clicking open to grant me unrestricted physical access to the lower levels. I snatched my clipboard back with a curt nod and immediately headed toward the service elevators. The metal doors of the service elevator slid open, depositing me into the pitch-black silence of sub-basement level 3. The air down here was thick, smelling of old concrete, stagnant water, and decaying insulation. The faint humming of the primary servers vibrating through the ceiling above was the only sound in the cavernous space. I pulled a small, high-powered flashlight from my tool belt and clicked it on. The bright beam of light pierced the darkness, illuminating endless rows of abandoned storage crates, rusted plumbing pipes, and discarded construction materials. I moved slowly and deliberately through the maze of debris. My 74-year-old knees ached with deep pain with every step, protesting the strain of the infiltration. I ignored the discomfort, forcing myself deeper into the forgotten bowels of the building. I reached the far northern wall of the basement. I ran my gloved hands along the surface of the drywall, counting the vertical support studs by pure memory. 3 studs from the corner right beneath a rusted water pipe. I pressed my weight against an unsealed square of the drywall. It yielded with a soft groan, sliding backward to reveal a dust-choked cavity. There it was. The original antiquated analog override terminal I had installed a quarter of a century ago. It was covered in a thick layer of grime and cobwebs, but the metal connection ports were completely intact. My hands shook with intense adrenaline and bone-deep exhaustion as I reached into my coat and pulled out Mitchell's decryption laptop. I blew the thick dust out of the primary connection port and firmly plugged the digital interface cable directly into the analog terminal. The laptop screen instantly illuminated the dark cavity with a harsh, glowing blue light. Lines of complex code began scrolling rapidly across the monitor as the military-grade software successfully bypassed the modern corporate firewalls and initiated a direct, untraceable connection into Maxwell's private executive servers. A bold green progress bar appeared on the screen indicating the massive download of the highly classified financial ledgers had successfully commenced. I let out a ragged, silent breath of relief, watching the percentage climb slowly. 5%, 10%, 15%. I was actually going to pull this off. Suddenly, the heavy metal door on the far side of the dark basement clicked loudly, and the brass handle began to rattle violently. Adrenaline flooded my system, instantly overriding the deep throbbing ache in my 74-year-old joints. I grabbed Mitchell's decryption laptop from the top of the override terminal, carefully keeping the connection cable plugged into the analog port. I spun around, my eyes scanning the pitch-black room for any possible cover. To my immediate left was a massive industrial steel storage rack, extending all the way up to the concrete ceiling. Just above the top shelf, a large galvanized ventilation grate had been left partially unscrewed from a previous maintenance job. It was a terribly tight space, but it was my absolutely only option. I shoved the heavy metal clipboard under my work jacket and began to climb. My steel-toed boots slipped against the smooth metal struts of the shelving unit. My hands gripped the cold, rusted edges, my muscles burning with an intensity I had not felt in decades. Every single movement sent sharp, shooting pain radiating up my spine, but the sheer terror of being caught fueled my ascent. I hoisted my body onto the top shelf just as the heavy basement door swung open. Two harsh, incredibly bright flashlight beams immediately cut through the darkness, sweeping methodically across the dusty concrete floor. I pressed my back flat against the freezing ceiling, desperately wedging myself into the narrow opening of the ventilation shaft. The space was incredibly cramped, pressing tightly against my shoulders and chest. I held the laptop securely against my stomach, angling the screen downward, so the faint blue glow would be completely hidden by my thick canvas jacket. The two security guards stepped fully into the room, their heavy boots echoing loudly in the cavernous space. They were speaking to each other in low, serious voices, discussing a tripped sensor on the perimeter fence. Their flashlight beams danced across the rusted plumbing pipes and the abandoned storage crates just inches below my dangling feet. Inside the ventilation shaft, the air was unbearably stale. A thick, suffocating cloud of ancient dust and fiberglass insulation, particles swirled directly into my face. My throat immediately began to tickle. A violent, irrepressible urge to cough surged up from my lungs. Panic seized me. If I made even the slightest sound, they would shine their lights directly up at the ceiling and spot me instantly. I opened my mouth, clamped my teeth down hard onto the thick fabric of my canvas sleeve, and bit down into my own forearm with every ounce of strength I possessed. The sharp, blinding pain effectively short-circuited the reflex to cough, but tears of pure agony streamed down my face. I squeezed my eyes shut, holding my breath until my lungs burned for oxygen. Beneath my jacket, I could feel the faint warmth of the decryption laptop. I slowly shifted my chin to look down at the glowing monitor. The green progress bar was crawling forward at an agonizingly slow pace. It hit 97%. The guards walked closer to my location, their flashlight beams pausing on the wall just a few feet away from the open drywall cavity. 98%. One of the guards muttered something about the temperature dropping and turned his flashlight toward the ceiling. I pressed myself deeper into the dirty metal shaft, closing my eyes and praying to whatever higher power was listening. 99%. The guard lowered his light, completely oblivious to the terminal hidden behind the wall. The progress bar finally clicked forward one last time, hitting 100%. A bold, silent notification flashed across the screen, confirming the entire financial ledger had been successfully downloaded and fully decrypted. The guards lingered for what felt like an absolute eternity, shining their lights into the far corners of the sub-basement, before finally turning around. They complained about the freezing draft pulling their jackets tight as they walked back toward the heavy metal door. The heavy brass latch clicked shut loudly behind them, instantly plunging the massive concrete room back into total, completely undisturbed darkness. I did not move a single muscle for 5 full minutes, making absolutely sure they were completely gone. When the silence remained unbroken, I carefully slid my aching body out of the ventilation shaft. I lowered myself down the steel storage rack, my arms trembling violently under my own weight. When my boots finally hit the concrete floor, my knees buckled entirely, sending a shockwave of white-hot pain shooting up my legs. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to stand back up. I walked over to the analog override terminal, cleanly yanked the data cable from the port, and quickly slid the drywall section back into its original place. I securely folded the laptop into my inner coat pocket and moved swiftly toward the emergency fire exit at the far end of the corridor. I pressed my weight against the heavy push bar of the metal door. The exact second, the magnetic seal broke, a deafening, high-pitched biometric alarm, instantly triggered, echoing furiously throughout the entire skyscraper. The digital security system had finally detected the unauthorized network breach. I shoved the door open and sprinted out into the freezing empty alleyway as the red strobe lights began to flash wildly behind me in the darkness. I ran down the cracked pavement of the alley with a speed I honestly did not know. My aging body still possessed. My lungs burned fiercely with the icy night air, and my steel-toed boots pounded heavily against the frozen ground. The blaring sirens of the corporate security system faded slightly as I rounded the corner onto the deserted side street. Mitchell Crawford was waiting exactly where we had planned. His dark sedan was idling quietly in the shadows, the passenger door already pushed open. I threw myself into the front seat, slamming the door shut behind me as I gasped desperately for oxygen. Mitchell immediately hit the gas, accelerating smoothly away from the towering glass building before any patrol cars could respond to the perimeter alarms. We drove in tense, heavy silence for 10 minutes until we were safely merged onto the interstate, completely hidden among the sparse late-night traffic. I pulled the decryption laptop from my jacket with trembling hands and passed it across the center console. Mitchell grabbed the device, resting it carefully on his lap, while keeping one hand steady on the steering wheel. He flipped open the screen, typed in his complex administrative password, and opened the master financial ledger we had just risked everything to extract. The artificial glow of the monitor illuminated his face in the dark cabin of the car. I watched closely as his eyes scanned the endless rows of raw corporate transactions. For a long moment, the only sound in the car was the heater and the rhythm of the tires. Then the color completely drained from his face. His skin turned an unnatural, sickly shade of pale. He slowed the vehicle slightly, his eyes locked onto a specific series of massive offshore wire transfers. He turned his head slowly to look at me, his expression a mixture of profound shock and deep brewing horror. "Tom," he whispered, his voice incredibly tight and serious. "You need to see this. It is an absolute bloodbath." I leaned across the center console of the idling sedan, squinting at the bright screen of the decryption laptop. My eyes, weary from exhaustion, but sharpened by decades of intense corporate scrutiny, began to scan the glowing lines of complex financial code. What I was looking at was the raw, unedited master ledger for the massive $256 million Tokyo port acquisition. I knew this contract intimately. I had personally negotiated every single clause, every minor stipulation, and every strict financial boundary over the last 72 hours. But the document displayed on Mitchell's screen was fundamentally different from the one I had verbally agreed upon with the Japanese syndicate just before 5 in the morning. Deep within the labyrinth of dense legal jargon and obscure international tax provisions, a brand new addendum had been maliciously injected into the final binding framework. It was buried so incredibly deep within the subclauses that no standard corporate auditor or external regulatory agency would ever think to look for it. Mitchell highlighted a specific line of code with his cursor. It was a massive, completely unauthorized phantom expenditure, labeled simply as an external brokerage consulting fee. My heart slammed painfully against my ribs as I read the numerical value attached to that single fabricated line item. It was for exactly $50 million. The sheer scale of the theft was absolutely staggering. Nexus Holdings was not just using my hard-earned international deal to artificially inflate their market valuation for the upcoming public offering. Maxwell Thorne and my own son had intentionally weaponized the entire corporate acquisition to facilitate a massive, highly illegal embezzlement scheme. They had deliberately overcharged the incredibly loyal Japanese real estate syndicate by $50 million, hiding the stolen capital behind a labyrinth of fake consulting services that were never actually rendered. I stared at the screen, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. The Tokyo investors had absolutely no idea they had just been robbed blind. They trusted me implicitly, and my own company had used that deep personal trust as a convenient smokescreen to orchestrate one of the most audacious financial crimes I had ever seen. But stealing $50 million in liquid cash from a highly monitored international corporate transaction is only half of the battle. You still have to successfully move that stolen money out of the heavily regulated American banking system without triggering a massive federal investigation. I asked Mitchell exactly where that massive sum of stolen capital had been routed. Mitchell adjusted his glasses, his fingers flying rapidly across the keyboard as he traced the digital breadcrumbs hidden within the master ledger. He bypassed layers of sophisticated corporate encryption following the money as it was frantically bounced through a dozen different proxy accounts to intentionally disguise its final destination, ensuring the federal authorities would be blindly chasing ghosts for years before they ever found the true culprits. After a few tense moments of typing, he finally isolated the primary exit node. The entire $50 million had been bundled into a single massive wire transfer. I looked closely at the digital timestamp attached to the outgoing transaction. The money was officially transferred out of the primary Nexus Holdings central accounts at exactly 2 minutes past 5 in the morning. That was exactly 3 minutes before I walked into that boardroom and was completely stripped of my corporate access. They had siphoned the money the absolute exact second the ink dried on the Tokyo contract and then immediately fired me to ensure the system lockdown would prevent anyone from noticing the massive missing funds. Mitchell traced the final destination of the massive wire transfer to a highly secretive, totally unregulated offshore banking institution located in the Cayman Islands. The receiving account belonged to a deeply hidden corporate shell entity officially registered under the name B. Stone Investments. I asked Mitchell if he could pierce the international privacy veils to find out exactly who actually owned that specific offshore shell company. Mitchell did not say a single word. He simply launched a complex deep web tracing program, utilizing the highly classified investigative tools he had retained from his days as a ruthless federal prosecutor. The specialized software aggressively chewed through the international corporate registries, tearing down the fake proxy identities one by one. After a few agonizingly tense minutes, the true unredacted corporate ownership documents finally appeared on the laptop screen. I felt the breath leave my lungs entirely. The registered corporate president of B. Stone Investments was not Maxwell Thorne. The offshore shell company was officially registered under the maiden name of my daughter-in-law, Brooke. Furthermore, the sole exclusive financial beneficiary of that deeply hidden $50 million Cayman account was my own flesh and blood. Cameron. My son was not just a complicit bystander in a corporate conspiracy. He was the primary architect of the entire massive embezzlement scheme. He had successfully stolen $50 million directly from the Japanese investors, funneled the cash into a secret account controlled by his materialistic wife, and then casually drove to my house to offer me a pathetic $2,000 allowance while pretending to be a concerned son. The sheer unfathomable evil of his actions made me physically nauseous. I had sacrificed my entire life to build him a golden path, and he had eagerly used it to completely destroy me. But a massive, lingering question still burned fiercely in my mind. Moving $50 million out of a highly monitored corporate holding account requires an elite level of executive clearance. The international banking authorities mandate a verified, cryptographically secure, digital signature to authorize an outgoing wire transfer of that immense magnitude. Even Maxwell Thorne, acting as the absolute chief executive officer, could not unilaterally push that kind of money offshore without triggering an immediate internal board review. Someone with direct, unrestricted acquisition authority had to physically sign off on the massive wire transfer. I asked Mitchell to open the final authorization logs to see exactly whose digital signature had been used to officially approve the highly illegal transaction. I assumed Maxwell and Cameron had simply forged a collective board approval document to bypass the standard corporate security protocols. Mitchell clicked on the Secure Authorization tab, expanding the final heavily encrypted digital receipt to fill the entire monitor. The interior of the car fell into a deafening, horrifying silence. Mitchell slowly looked up from the glowing screen, his eyes suddenly filled with a deep, profound sorrow that I had never seen in him before. The $50 million offshore wire transfer was absolutely not authorized by Maxwell Thorne. It was not signed by Cameron or any other corrupted member of the executive board. The illegal transaction that robbed the Tokyo Syndicate and fundamentally violated federal securities law had been officially approved, fully signed, and permanently stamped by one single indisputable digital signature. It was mine. They had stolen my exact digital identity to seamlessly commit the perfect financial crime, leaving me completely defenseless against the inevitable federal fallout. The sickening reality of their precise timing hit me with the destructive force of a freight train. I sat completely paralyzed in the passenger seat of Mitchell's idling sedan, staring blankly at the glowing screen of the decryption laptop as the horrifying mechanics of their trap finally became clear. Maxwell Thorne and my own son had not just fired me to push me out of the company before the public offering. They had meticulously orchestrated a flawless, airtight frame-up. The $50 million wire transfer to the Cayman Islands was fully executed and permanently logged into the central banking network at exactly 2 minutes past 5 in the morning. That was the precise moment I was walking down the quiet carpeted hallway toward the executive boardroom, utterly exhausted and completely oblivious to the danger waiting behind those heavy oak doors. 3 minutes later, at exactly 5:05, they slid that termination folder across the mahogany table and ordered their security guards to physically confiscate my corporate smartphone and my encrypted laptop. At the time, I foolishly believed they were simply being cruel and enforcing standard disciplinary protocols to humiliate me in front of my peers. But sitting in the freezing car looking at the irrefutable digital evidence, I finally understood the true depth of their malice. They did not take my electronic devices just to lock me out of the corporate network. They took them specifically to ensure I could never hire a forensic technology expert to prove I did not initiate that massive offshore transfer. By seizing my hardware, the very second the money left the building, they gained absolute unchecked control over the digital narrative. They could easily fabricate local access logs, manipulate the internal firewall histories, and seamlessly paint a picture of a disgruntled retiring senior executive who decided to steal a massive fortune on his way out the door. My own flesh and blood had deliberately stolen my digital identity, weaponized my massive professional success against me, and systematically stripped away every single piece of physical evidence I could possibly use to defend my innocence. The sheer calculated perfection of the setup left me gasping for air. Cameron had smiled at me the night before the Tokyo deal closed. He had shaken my hand, patted my shoulder, and told me how incredibly proud he was of my lifelong dedication to the firm. Every single word was a deliberate poison-laced lie designed to keep me completely docile while he quietly dug my grave. He had watched me sacrifice everything for him and only to turn around and enthusiastically hand me the rope for my own execution. The betrayal was so incredibly vast, so fundamentally evil, that my mind physically rejected it. I asked Mitchell if there was any possible way to trace the actual physical location of the computer that authorized the fake transfer. Mitchell shook his head slowly, his jaw tightly clenched in simmering, undeniable anger as he continued to type. I waited in the heavy, suffocating silence of the dark vehicle. Mitchell's fingers flew across the keyboard once again, diving even deeper into the restricted communication archives hidden within the decrypted master ledger. He bypassed a secondary security wall and opened a highly classified, heavily encrypted internal memorandum sent directly from Maxwell Thorne to a private unlisted email address belonging to Cameron. Mitchell began to read the cold, sterile text aloud, his voice dropping to a harsh, gravelly whisper. The memorandum meticulously detailed their final exit strategy for the stolen capital. They were not simply going to let the missing $50 million remain a permanent mystery. A massive financial discrepancy of that unprecedented magnitude would inevitably trigger a mandatory, highly aggressive internal audit prior to the upcoming initial public offering, and they needed a perfectly viable scapegoat ready to take the devastating fall. The encrypted document clearly outlined their intention to wait exactly 4 weeks, allowing the corporate public offering to officially launch and artificially inflate their personal net worth into the billions. The very next morning, Cameron was instructed to anonymously leak a fabricated dossier of falsified financial irregularities directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission. They were going to voluntarily trigger a massive federal investigation and eagerly hand the government a meticulously forged paper trail pointing directly at my doorstep. Mitchell looked away from the glowing monitor, his eyes filled with a terrifying mixture of pity and rage. "They are going to serve you up to the federal authorities on a silver platter," Tom Mitchell said quietly. "They are going to claim you embezzled the Tokyo funds to fund your retirement, and with your digital signature officially attached to the wire transfer, the government will not hesitate to prosecute. They intend to send a 74-year-old man to a maximum security federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life, knowing you will likely die behind bars long before you could ever clear your name. Meanwhile, your son and his wife will be sitting safely on a multi-million-dollar private estate in the Hamptons, completely insulated by their new corporate wealth and thoroughly enjoying the massive fortune they stole in your name." The utter depravity of the internal memo hung heavily in the stale air of the idling sedan. They were not just stealing my money. They were actively planning to steal my freedom. In that exact defining moment, something incredibly fundamental and irreversible completely fractured inside my chest. The suffocating grief of a heartbroken father instantly evaporated entirely, replaced by the cold, calculating wrath of a seasoned corporate predator who had survived 4 decades in the most ruthless industry on Earth. I looked out at the distant, glittering skyline of the city I had helped conquer, feeling a sudden, terrifying sense of absolute clarity wash over my aging mind. Cameron and Maxwell believed my advanced age made me weak, docile, and completely incapable of mounting a sophisticated defense against their massive conspiracy. They assumed I would quietly surrender to my unearned fate, crying alone in a federal courtroom while they counted their stolen millions. They were about to learn a brutally devastating lesson about the true nature of vengeance. I reached out and firmly closed the decryption laptop, cutting off the harsh blue light and plunging the interior of the car into total darkness. I turned back to Mitchell, my voice echoing with a low, dangerous calm that surprised even myself. "They think I am just going to roll over and die quietly in a concrete cell," I whispered, staring directly into the shadowed eyes of my oldest trusted friend. "They genuinely think they can use the corporate empire I built to orchestrate my execution. Mitchell, I need you to get me a highly secure, untraceable satellite line to Tokyo right now. We are absolutely not going to the local police with this stolen ledger just yet. If we strike right now, they will simply bury the offshore funds and hire elite lawyers. We are going to let them climb to the absolute highest peak of their fragile mountain first, so everyone can watch them fall. We are going to build a slaughterhouse." Mitchell nodded silently, completely understanding the dangerous fundamental shift in my overall demeanor. He reached into the hidden compartment of his battered leather briefcase and pulled out a heavily encrypted satellite phone. It was a specialized, untraceable burner device specifically designed to bounce its signal across a dozen international servers before ever connecting to its final destination. He handed the device to me across the center console of the idling vehicle. I took a deep breath, steadying my racing heart, and dialed a private, unlisted international number that I had committed to memory more than 2 decades ago. The secure line clicked loudly and hissed with electronic static for a brief, tense moment before connecting directly to the highly guarded private residence of Kenji Tanaka in Tokyo. When Kenji finally answered the phone, His voice was thick with sleep and understandable confusion at the sudden, unregistered intrusion into his personal life. I did not speak to him in English. Instead, I greeted him respectfully, in flawless, deeply traditional Japanese. It was a vital, incredibly hard-earned skill that I had spent years mastering in order to solidify our decades-long business relationship. My son, in all his arrogant, youthful brilliance, had completely forgotten that I possessed this specific linguistic ability. Cameron simply assumed I was just another aging American executive who relied entirely on corporate translators to conduct international business deals. That singular catastrophic oversight on his part was going to be the absolute key to his total destruction. I quickly apologized to Kenji for the extreme hour and the highly irregular method of communication. I told him, speaking softly and urgently in his native tongue, that a massive financial crisis had just occurred regarding our recently finalized port acquisition. I informed him that he needed to quietly board his private jet immediately and fly directly to the United States under the strictest veil of absolute secrecy. I told him that he had been robbed. Less than 24 hours later, I was standing inside a heavily guarded, climate-controlled private aviation hangar located on the desolate outskirts of New York City. The massive steel doors of the hangar were pulled tightly shut, completely isolating us from the prying eyes of the outside world. Mitchell stood quietly by my side as a sleek, unmarked Gulfstream jet smoothly taxied into the massive space and abruptly cut its powerful engines. The customized cabin door opened slowly, and Kenji Tanaka stepped down onto the polished concrete floor. He was flanked by two stoic, incredibly imposing security personnel, but his face was an unreadable mask of tightly controlled tension. He approached me with a crisp, formal bow, but his dark, intelligent eyes were blazing with intense, unspoken questions. I returned his bow with equal respect, then immediately guided him toward a stark metal conference table that had been securely set up near the back of the silent hangar. I did not waste any time with empty, polite pleasantries. I opened Mitchell's decryption laptop, firmly plugged in the extracted flash drive, and turned the glowing monitor directly toward the powerful Japanese billionaire. I walked him methodically through every single page of the raw, unedited master ledger. I showed him exactly how Maxwell Thorne and my own son had maliciously injected the $50 million phantom brokerage consulting fee into the final subclauses of his commercial contract. I showed him the exact digital timestamps, the highly illegal offshore wire routing numbers, and the ultimate destination of the stolen capital, currently residing comfortably in a Cayman Islands shell account controlled entirely by my greedy daughter-in-law. Kenji absorbed the irrefutable digital evidence of the massive corporate theft. The color drained completely from his face. His carefully maintained composure instantly shattered entirely, replaced by a sudden, terrifying display of profound fury. He slammed his closed fists down onto the metal table, his voice echoing fiercely throughout the empty aviation hangar. He swore to bring the absolute full weight of his elite international legal team down upon Nexus Holdings. He promised to launch an immediate, highly public corporate lawsuit that would instantly freeze their domestic assets, absolutely destroy their upcoming public offering, and drag Maxwell and Cameron into a devastating, extremely public international tribunal. I raised my hand gently, respectfully, asking for his silence. I looked him dead in the eye and delivered the hardest, most crucial pitch of my entire corporate career. I told him that if he sued them right now, they would instantly panic. They would immediately bury the offshore money under dozens of new proxy accounts, hire the most ruthless defense attorneys in America, and violently drag the resulting litigation out for a decade. They would inevitably claim the transaction was a simple administrative error, and they might even escape federal prison. I leaned forward slightly, lowering my voice to a deadly, extremely serious whisper. I told him we could not let them hide. I said if you sue them right now, they hide the money permanently. You must let them artificially inflate their initial public offering. You must give me exactly 6 months. Let them climb onto the highest, most visible public stage in the entire financial world. When they are standing at the absolute peak of their unearned success, we cut the ropes. Kenji stared at me for a long, incredibly heavy moment in the freezing hangar. The raw, explosive in his eyes slowly shifted, gradually cooling into a sharp, predatory calculation. He was a ruthless businessman, and he instantly recognized the tactical brilliance of a delayed, highly public corporate execution. A slow, dark smile crept across his face, and he firmly extended his hand across the metal table to officially seal our new highly secretive alliance. Kenji did not just agree to my aggressive 6-month timeline. He immediately utilized his immense political influence to quietly bring in the elite white-collar crime division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, placing them strictly under a classified off-the-books mandate to secretly monitor the stolen offshore funds. With the federal agents securely in place and quietly tracking every single digital movement my son made, I completely vanished from the corporate world. I went entirely off the grid. I moved into a cheap, dilapidated motel on the forgotten edge of the city, deliberately abandoning my tailored executive suits for worn, oversized clothing. I fully committed to playing the tragic, pathetic role of a defeated, broken old man who had simply given up on life. I completely allowed my son to believe his cruel manipulation had successfully crushed my spirit. But in the quiet, undisturbed shadows of my dingy motel room, I was working tirelessly. I spent every single night securely funneling every byte of decrypted corporate data, every hidden email, and every falsified transaction directly to the waiting federal agents. I was meticulously building the invisible, inescapable cage that would soon trap my son, waiting patiently in the dark for the perfect moment to finally spring the lock. The next 6 months passed in an agonizingly slow, deliberate crawl. From the cramped, dimly lit confines of my cheap motel room on the forgotten outskirts of the city, I watched the world completely fall for their massive, glittering lie. I spent my days eating canned soup and wearing faded, oversized clothing, making absolutely sure that anyone who saw me would simply see a broken, defeated old man who had completely given up on life. But my nights were spent securely tethered to a highly encrypted federal network, feeding every single byte of intercepted financial data directly to Mitchell Crawford and his elite team of federal agents. Through the digital surveillance we had quietly established, I watched my son and his wife rapidly descend into a sickening display of uncontrollable excessive greed. The $50 million they had stolen from the Tokyo syndicate was burning a massive hole in their pockets. Cameron, acting under the arrogant delusion of absolute invincibility, officially purchased a custom-built 70-foot luxury yacht. He docked it at an exclusive marina downtown, openly flaunting his sudden, inexplicable wealth to anyone who would look. Brooke was even worse. She completely renovated her newly acquired $2.5 million Hamptons estate, importing rare Italian marble and hiring a team of elite celebrity interior designers. She aggressively plastered every single lavish detail across her public social media accounts, utterly convinced she had finally achieved the elite upper-class status she had always desperately craved. Meanwhile, the corrupt corporate empire of Nexus Holdings was completely soaring on the back of my stolen labor. The financial media aggressively swallowed their fabricated narrative without a single question. Maxwell Thorne, the arrogant, 38-year-old chief executive who had coldly authorized my execution, was suddenly being paraded across every major business network as a generational visionary. He even landed squarely on the front cover of Forbes magazine, officially dubbed the brilliant boy genius of modern commercial real estate. I sat on my lumpy motel mattress, staring at the glossy magazine cover featuring his smug, perfectly manicured face. I was enthusiastically taking absolute credit for the massive international port acquisition that I had spent 3 grueling days negotiating. He proudly announced that the monumental success of the Tokyo deal had perfectly positioned Nexus Holdings for an unprecedented multi-billion-dollar initial public offering. The entire financial world was eagerly lining up to hand them billions of dollars in fresh investment capital. They had successfully built an absolutely massive, towering mountain of pure deception and they genuinely believed they were completely untouchable. I simply watched them climb higher and higher, knowing perfectly well that the air at the very top of that specific mountain was about to get incredibly thin, and the fall would be absolutely devastating to witness. During those long 6 months, Cameron occasionally felt the arrogant need to reach out and ensure I was still properly subdued. He would send me these incredibly condescending text messages from his secure corporate phone. He wanted to make absolutely certain that I was quietly accepting my pathetic fate. One evening, right as the official launch date for the initial public offering was finally announced, my cheap prepaid cellular phone buzzed loudly on the wooden nightstand. I picked it up and opened a new message from my son. The text was brutally short and dripping with unearned superiority. It read, "Hope you are surviving all right on the monthly allowance, Dad. The media attention around the company is getting pretty intense right now. Make sure you just keep your head down and stay completely out of the way." I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, reading the cold, dismissive words over and over again. My own flesh and blood, a man who had stolen $50 million using my forged digital signature, was casually advising me to stay quiet so he could successfully finalize the largest financial fraud in the history of the company. A deep, primal wave of anger washed over my chest, but I quickly suppressed it. I could not afford to let my bruised ego compromise the meticulous trap we had spent half a year building. The federal agents were already in position. The indictments were fully drafted and secretly signed by a federal judge. Kenji Tanaka had completely secured the final phase of the operation in Tokyo. We were literally days away from dropping the hammer, and I needed Cameron to remain entirely comfortable in his dangerous delusion. I took a slow, deep breath, carefully regulating my emotions. I typed out a perfectly submissive, utterly defeated response, designed to completely satisfy his massive, fragile ego. I simply wrote back, "Thank you, son. I am doing just fine. Good luck with the big public launch." I pressed send and tossed the cheap phone onto the worn mattress. I knew that short, pathetic response would be the absolute ultimate validation for him. He would look at his expensive phone, smile at his beautiful wife, and confidently reassure her that the clueless old man had been completely neutralized. He genuinely believed he had successfully and permanently beaten me. The highly anticipated night of the Nexus Holdings initial public offering gala finally arrived. The massive, extravagant event was hosted at the incredibly prestigious Ritz-Carlton Hotel right in the beating heart of downtown Chicago. The corporate organizers had spared absolutely no expense to project an aura of total financial invincibility. The grand ballroom was packed tightly with hundreds of powerful Wall Street elites, influential local politicians, and aggressive financial journalists eager to capture the monumental launch. Tonight was the highly publicized ceremony where Maxwell Thorne would ring the golden bell, officially making him and my traitorous son certified billionaires in the public market. Outside the lavish hotel, a massive red carpet was rolled out to welcome the constant stream of arriving corporate dignitaries. The security perimeter was incredibly tight, crawling with heavily armed private guards instructed to keep the general public far away from the elite celebration. A long, sleek black town car slowly pulled up to the curb, smoothly coming to a stop directly at the very front of the exclusive VIP entrance. The heavy rear door of the vehicle opened slowly. A man stepped out onto the plush red carpet, adjusting his crisp cuffs. He was not wearing faded, oversized clothing. He was not walking with the defeated, broken posture of an elderly man surviving on a pathetic monthly allowance. He was dressed immaculately in a pristine, custom-tailored Tom Ford tuxedo that radiated absolute, undeniable authority. He looked up at the towering, brilliantly lit hotel, his eyes reflecting a cold, incredibly dangerous, calculating resolve. It was me. And I was finally ready to burn their beautiful, stolen empire completely to the ground tonight. The freezing Chicago wind bit at my face as I stepped out of the warm leather interior of the black town car. But for the very first time in 6 long months, I did not feel the cold. I stood tall on the edge of the plush red carpet leading up to the grand entrance of the Ritz-Carlton, completely shedding the hunched, defeated posture I had carefully maintained while living in that miserable motel. I smoothed my hands down the lapels of my pristine, custom-tailored tuxedo. It felt like putting on a suit of armor. The bright flashing lights of the financial press illuminated the night, capturing the arrival of the city elite as they gathered to celebrate the highly anticipated public launch of Nexus Holdings. I began my slow, deliberate walk up the velvet ropes, my polished shoes sinking slightly into the thick carpet with every step. The entrance was heavily fortified. A line of massive, broad-shouldered private security guards stood like a human wall in front of the ornate glass doors armed with biometric scanners and digital guest lists. I recognized the security firm immediately. They were the absolute best money could buy, hired specifically by Maxwell Thorne to ensure no unwanted guests crashed his monumental victory lap. As I approached the front of the line, two of the largest guards immediately stepped forward, crossing their muscular arms and completely blocking my path. The lead guard, a stern man with a thick earpiece, looked me up and down with an expression of professional disdain. He asked for my digital invitation, his voice flat and authoritative, clearly expecting me to turn around and walk away. I maintained a calm, steady gaze, looking directly into his eyes, without a single trace of intimidation. I told him I did not have a digital invitation on my phone. The guard let out a heavy, impatient sigh, reaching out to physically guide me away from the entrance. He told me the entire hotel was closed for a private corporate event, and if I did not leave the premises immediately, he would have me arrested for trespassing. I did not move a single inch. Instead, I calmly reached into the interior pocket of my tuxedo jacket. I withdrew a heavy solid metal lanyard and held it up between us. Hanging from the thick black ribbon was a solid titanium platinum investor badge. It was not a standard guest pass. It was an elite, unforgeable credential personally issued and cryptographically registered by Kenji Tanaka himself, explicitly granting the bearer absolute unquestionable access to any corporate event associated with his international syndicate. The lead guard stopped dead in his tracks. He stared at the heavy metal badge, his eyes widening as he recognized the supreme level of clearance it represented. He quickly raised a handheld scanner, running a red laser over the embedded barcode on the back of the titanium plate. The small device chimed with a pleasant, bright green light, instantly verifying my supreme authority. The guard's entire demeanor shifted in a fraction of a second. The arrogant disdain vanished entirely, replaced by a rigid, deeply respectful posture. He immediately stepped aside, pulling the heavy velvet rope back with a sharp, professional nod. He apologized profusely for the delay and welcomed me to the gala. I slipped the heavy badge back into my jacket, offering him a polite, dismissive nod as I walked through the grand glass doors and stepped into the warm, glittering belly of the beast. The interior of the grand ballroom was an absolute masterpiece of extreme, unrestrained corporate opulence. Massive crystal chandeliers hung heavily from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over the hundreds of wealthy investors and ambitious Wall Street executives packing the room. The air was thick with the scent of expensive, perfume-aged scotch and the intoxicating thrill of unearned greed. A live jazz quartet played softly in the corner, entirely drowned out by the loud, confident chatter of people who believed they were utterly invincible. I moved slowly through the dense crowd, a silent phantom slipping seamlessly through a sea of tailored suits and designer gowns. A passing waiter offered a silver tray filled with crystal flutes. I smoothly picked up a glass of chilled champagne, taking a small, calculated sip as I scanned the massive room for my target. It did not take me long to find them. Cameron and Brooke were standing right near the front of the main stage, completely surrounded by a small, captivated audience of influential local politicians and elite banking executives. Brooke was wearing a blindingly expensive diamond necklace, throwing her head back in a shrill, theatrical laugh at a joke a state senator had just told. Cameron stood right beside her, holding a glass of dark amber liquor, beaming with the smug, deeply arrogant confidence of a man who firmly believed he had outsmarted the entire world. I walked deliberately toward their tight circle, my eyes locked entirely on my son. As I closed the distance, Brooke happened to glance over the shoulder of the senator. Her eyes casually swept past me, then violently snapped back. The color instantly drained from her perfectly contoured face. Her jaw dropped open in an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. She nudged Cameron frantically, her manicured fingers digging sharply into his expensive suit jacket. Cameron turned his head, a look of profound annoyance crossing his face until his eyes finally landed on mine. The sudden absolute shock hit him like a physical blow to the chest. He stumbled backward, his hand jerking so violently that his heavy crystal glass tipped sideways, spilling dark amber liquor all over the pristine white tablecloth and the expensive shoes of a nearby executive. The surrounding politicians paused, looking at him in utter confusion as his face turned incredibly pale. I stepped right into the center of their exclusive circle, maintaining an expression of absolute, terrifying calm. Cameron gasped for air, his voice barely a panicked, trembling whisper. "Dad!" He choked out his eyes, darting frantically around the room, as if searching for an escape route. "What are you doing here? Security will arrest you." I did not raise my voice, nor did I show any of the profound rage that had been simmering quietly inside my chest for the last 6 long, agonizing months. Instead, I simply smiled. It was a cold, sharp, and incredibly calculated smile that completely failed to reach my eyes. I stepped forward, closing the final few inches between us, until I was standing entirely within his personal, guarded space. The scent of his expensive cologne completely failed to mask the sudden, sour odor of pure terror radiating from him. I slowly raised my crystal flute of chilled champagne, tilting it forward until the delicate rim gently tapped against the side of his violently trembling glass. The soft, high-pitched chime of the crystal colliding rang out, like a tiny crystalline bell of doom over the loud chatter of the ballroom. "I came to celebrate, son," I whispered. "Enjoy this beautiful view from the top, because the massive fall is going to break every single bone in your body." Cameron stared at me with wide, terrified eyes as the clinking of our crystal glasses faded into the loud, oblivious chatter of the surrounding ballroom. The sheer panic washing over his face was so incredibly intense that he literally forgot how to speak. He took 2 clumsy steps backward, nearly tripping over the edge of a heavy velvet curtain, before turning and sprinting frantically through the dense crowd of wealthy investors. Brooke remained frozen in place, her mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish gasping for air, until she finally spun around and hurried after her husband. I stood perfectly still, taking another slow, measured sip of my champagne. I tracked Cameron with my eyes as he pushed his way desperately toward the far corner of the massive room, where Maxwell Thorne was currently holding court with a group of powerful international bankers. I watched closely as Cameron grabbed the young chief executive by the arm, pulling him aside and whispering frantically into his ear. Maxwell's confident, arrogant smile instantly vanished. His sharp eyes darted across the ballroom, scanning the crowd until they finally locked directly onto mine. A flash of pure, unadulterated fury distorted his perfectly manicured features. He immediately barked a sharp order to his private security detail. 2 massive, heavily muscled bodyguards in dark suits stepped forward, flanking him tightly, as he began a swift, aggressive march directly toward my position. The crowd naturally parted for the chief executive, utterly unaware of the explosive confrontation about to unfold right in the middle of their glamorous celebration. Maxwell stopped just inches from my face, his breathing heavy with barely contained rage. His 2 enormous guards stepped up right behind him, crossing their thick arms and attempting to physically intimidate me with their sheer size. Maxwell leaned in incredibly close, invading my personal space in a pathetic attempt to assert absolute dominance. He lowered his voice to a harsh, venomous whisper, ensuring the surrounding politicians and wealthy guests could not hear his threats. "Listen to me very carefully, you pathetic old fossil," Maxwell hissed, his eyes burning with intense malice. "I do not know what kind of delusional game you think you are playing, or how you managed to sneak past my front door, but you are going to turn around and walk out of this building right this very second. If you do not leave quietly, I will personally have my men drag you out to the alley, beat you senseless, and throw you in a holding cell for corporate trespassing. You are absolutely nothing to me anymore, Tom. You are a ghost. You have no power here, and you are entirely out of your depth." I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I simply looked at the arrogant, 38-year-old boy who honestly believed he had successfully orchestrated the perfect financial crime, and I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, heavy sense of impending total and absolute destruction. I calmly reached down and smoothly adjusted my silver cufflinks, refusing to break eye contact with the furious chief executive standing right in front of me. I let a long, agonizing moment of silence stretch between us, allowing my utter lack of fear to deeply unnerve him. "You stole my secure digital signature at exactly 2 minutes past 5 in the morning. Maxwell," I said, keeping my voice incredibly calm, steady, and loud enough for Cameron to hear as he hovered nervously just a few feet away. I saw the sudden microscopic flinch in Maxwell's eyes. The blood slowly began to drain from his flushed cheeks. "Did you really think I would not physically check the internal network internet protocol logs?" I continued, taking one single predatory step forward to completely close the distance between us. "Did you honestly believe that an executive who spent 4 decades building the very foundation of this entire company would not immediately notice that the massive $50 million offshore wire transfer actually originated directly from your personal private media access control address?" The sheer, overwhelming reality of my words struck him with the devastating, undeniable force of a physical weapon. The false, arrogant bravado that he had so carefully maintained all evening completely evaporated in a single fraction of a second. He was no longer the brilliant, untouchable boy genius gracing the glossy covers of prestigious financial magazines. He was suddenly just a terrified, cornered thief who realized he had made a fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. I leaned in, slightly lowering my voice to a sharp, menacing whisper that cut entirely through the surrounding ballroom noise. "You intentionally stole my identity, Maxwell, and you enthusiastically planned to frame a 74-year-old man to rot and die in a federal penitentiary just to cover up your own sickening corporate greed. You thought my advanced age meant I was completely obsolete, blind, and totally defenseless against your sophisticated modern technology. But you fundamentally forgot the most important rule of the business world you desperately pretend to understand. You never, ever declare absolute victory until you are absolutely certain your opponent is completely buried. Now, because of your profound, foolish arrogance, you are entirely exposed. I have carefully collected every single digital footprint you left behind, and your fragile stolen empire is standing directly on the very edge of a deep, inescapable abyss tonight." Maxwell turned completely ghost white, his entire body trembling as the horrifying reality of his impending destruction fully set in. His jaw locked tightly, and a bead of cold sweat rolled slowly down the side of his pale face. He aggressively grabbed the thick sleeve of the massive security guard standing to his left, his voice cracking as he delivered a desperate, frantic command. "Grab this old man right now," Maxwell whispered violently, his eyes darting around the crowded room to ensure no one was watching their chaotic interaction. "Drag him down to the underground security basement immediately. Confiscate that badge, break his phone, and do not let him speak to a single person under any circumstances." The 2 heavily muscled bodyguards aggressively stepped forward, their massive hands reaching out simultaneously to violently grab my shoulders. I did not flinch, and I did not attempt to step away from their incoming grasp. I simply stood my ground, maintaining a cold, unyielding stare directly into Maxwell's terrified eyes. But before the heavy hands of the corporate guards could even graze the pristine fabric of my custom tuxedo jacket, the lively jazz music echoing across the ballroom suddenly cut off. The brilliant, sparkling crystal chandeliers hanging directly above us dimmed drastically, plunging the massive room into a hush of dramatic, expectant silence. A single, blindingly bright spotlight suddenly cut through the darkness, illuminating the grand central stage at the far end of the venue. The master of ceremonies stepped up to the crystal podium, tapping the microphone loudly. The sudden booming sound of his voice echoed fiercely across the expansive room, capturing the undivided attention of every single wealthy investor and powerful politician present. It was officially time for the momentous initial public offering announcement, and the trap was now completely sprung. The master of ceremonies enthusiastically introduced the visionary leaders of Nexus Holdings to the eager crowd. Maxwell and Cameron had absolutely no choice but to abandon our tense confrontation and make their way up the carpeted stairs to the grand stage. I watched them walk under the blinding glare of the spotlights. They were trying desperately to project the image of triumphant, unstoppable billionaires, but I could clearly see the sheer terror radiating from their rigid postures. Maxwell's expensive suit suddenly looked a size too large on his shrinking frame. Cameron was sweating profusely frequently, wiping his damp palms against his trousers as he stepped up to stand slightly behind his chief executive. The massive ballroom erupted into a deafening roar of applause from the hundreds of wealthy investors and ambitious politicians who had gathered to witness the birth of a brand new real estate empire. Maxwell gripped the edges of the crystal podium so tightly that his knuckles turned completely white. He forced a wide, incredibly fake smile across his pale face and leaned into the microphone. He began to deliver a highly scripted, deeply hypocritical speech about the core values of Nexus Holdings. He spoke at length about corporate transparency, unwavering financial integrity, and the sacred trust they built with their international partners. He boldly looked directly into the flashing camera lenses and arrogantly claimed that Nexus Holdings was a company built strictly on the unyielding principles of complete honesty, fundamental fairness, and mutual respect. He stated firmly that they absolutely never, ever took any shortcuts and fiercely protected the hard-earned capital of every single valued investor who placed their ultimate financial trust in their capable, highly skilled, and visionary hands. Hearing the man, who had just orchestrated a $50 million embezzlement scheme lecture a room full of Wall Street elites about honesty, was absolutely nauseating. Cameron nodded along like a well-trained puppet, though his terrified eyes kept darting nervously toward the back of the room, where I stood watching them burn. Maxwell raised his voice to a triumphant crescendo, declaring that their unprecedented success was entirely due to the monumental commercial port acquisition they had finalized exactly 6 months ago. He then gestured grandly toward the front row of the VIP seating area. He invited the entire ballroom to direct their attention to their most esteemed international partner. He asked the crowd to give a massive round of applause for the visionary leader of the Tokyo real estate syndicate, Kenji Tanaka. The entire ballroom immediately shifted their attention onto the front row, erupting into a second wave of thunderous applause. Kenji Tanaka slowly stood up from his reserved seat. He was dressed in a remarkably sharp, traditional dark suit, his expression completely unreadable and carved from pure stone. He did not smile. He did not wave to the cheering crowd. He simply buttoned his jacket and walked with slow, deliberate precision up the short staircase to the main stage. Maxwell stepped aside, offering Kenji a deep, subservient bow while gesturing toward the crystal podium. Cameron looked like he was about to physically vomit right there on the stage. The applause gradually died down, replaced by a hushed, expectant silence, as the powerful international billionaire leaned slightly toward the microphone. Everyone in that massive room fully expected a standard, polite speech expressing mutual gratitude and shared financial prosperity. Instead, Kenji gripped the sides of the podium and looked out over the sea of wealthy investors with absolute disgust. He began to speak in flawless, unaccented English, his deep voice carrying a cold, terrifying authority that instantly paralyzed the entire room. Nexus Holdings is indeed a truly remarkable corporate institution, Kenji stated, his voice echoing loudly through the state-of-the-art sound system. It is so remarkably corrupt that their brilliant chief executive officer and their vice president of operations managed to successfully steal $50 million of my personal syndicate money, right, while actively firing the only honest man left in this entire building. The heavy words hung in the air for a fraction of a second before the sheer magnitude of his statement truly registered with the audience. Kenji did not stop. He methodically detailed exactly how the phantom brokerage consulting fee was maliciously injected into the final commercial port contract. He loudly announced the exact name of the offshore shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. He explicitly named my daughter-in-law as the registered owner and my son as the sole financial beneficiary. He systematically dismantled their entire multi-billion-dollar illusion in less than 2 minutes, exposing them as nothing more than common thieves hiding behind tailored suits and false corporate titles. I watched Maxwell's face twist into an expression of profound, inescapable horror as he realized his entire life was completely over. He had climbed to the absolute peak of the financial mountain, only to have the ground completely ripped out from underneath him by the very man he thought he had successfully robbed. The grand ballroom instantly erupted into a state of absolute unprecedented chaos. The stunned silence shattered into a deafening roar of frantic shouting and panicked confusion. Hundreds of wealthy investors who had just committed massive amounts of capital to the initial public offering began screaming frantically into their mobile phones, desperately trying to pull their investments before the markets officially opened. Dozens of aggressive financial journalists, realizing they were witnessing the greatest corporate implosion of the entire decade, aggressively pushed their way toward the front of the stage. The bright flashes of their cameras strobed relentlessly, capturing the devastating humiliation of the young executives in real time. Maxwell completely lost what little remained of his composure. He lunged frantically toward the crystal podium, wildly attempting to grab the microphone away from the Japanese billionaire. He screamed at the top of his lungs, commanding his private security detail to immediately cut the audio feeds and physically remove Kenji from the stage. But the massive bodyguards who had threatened me just minutes ago simply stood frozen in place, completely unsure of how to handle the sudden catastrophic public disaster unfolding before their eyes. Cameron dropped entirely to his knees, right there on the stage, burying his pale, sweating face into his trembling hands, as the reality of his impending federal prison sentence finally crushed him. The glamorous celebration had violently morphed into a spectacular, unavoidable slaughterhouse, exactly as I had promised. I took a slow, highly satisfying sip of my chilled champagne, watching the magnificent destruction of their stolen empire from the quiet edge of the panicked crowd. Maxwell continued to scream frantically for someone to restore order to the chaotic room. He aggressively ordered his remaining security personnel to immediately evacuate the executive board members out through the rear exit doors before the local press could swarm them. But before a single person could even attempt to flee the massive room, a sudden heavy mechanical sound echoed over the roar of the panicked crowd. The massive mahogany doors of the grand ballroom, the only physical exits leading out of the venue, all slammed shut simultaneously and locked with a loud, terrifying, and completely final clack. The deafening mechanical clack of the heavy mahogany doors locking shut sent an immediate, terrifying shockwave through the massive ballroom. The frantic screaming and the aggressive pushing of the panicked crowd came to a sudden, absolute halt, replaced by a tense, suffocating silence. Hundreds of powerful Wall Street elites, influential local politicians, and wealthy international investors stood completely frozen in place, turning their heads collectively toward the main entrances. For a fleeting second, the sheer confusion in the room was palpable. Maxwell Thorne stood on the brightly lit stage, his chest heaving as he stared out over the sea of terrified faces, completely unable to comprehend how his perfect night had violently derailed. The towering private security guards, the very men Maxwell had personally hired to keep out the unwanted public and protect his fraudulent victory, slowly stepped away from the barricaded doors. I watched from the edge of the crowd, with a deep, profound sense of satisfaction, as the impeccably dressed guards simultaneously reached for the thick brass zippers of their dark suit jackets. In perfect synchronized precision, they pulled their zippers down and swiftly shrugged off their outer layers. Underneath their expensive corporate attire, every single one of them was wearing a thick, dark navy blue tactical windbreaker, bold. Bright yellow letters were printed clearly across their chests and backs, spelling out the letters FBI. The entire private security detail had been completely compromised and entirely replaced by undercover federal agents, long before the very first wealthy guest had even arrived on the red carpet. A collective gasp of pure horror rippled through the glamorous crowd as the stunning reality of the situation finally set in. The elite guests suddenly realized they were no longer attending a highly exclusive corporate celebration. They were standing directly in the middle of a massive, heavily coordinated federal sting operation. Before the panicked crowd could even attempt to react to the undercover agents, the distinct piercing wail of dozens of police sirens suddenly erupted from the freezing Chicago streets directly outside the hotel. The deafening noise echoed furiously through the thick glass windows, signaling the arrival of the heavily armed exterior perimeter teams. The main double doors of the grand ballroom were violently thrust open from the outside. Mitchell Crawford, my oldest friend, and the ruthless former federal prosecutor, who had helped me orchestrate this entire beautiful trap, marched confidently into the center of the room. He was not wearing a tuxedo. He was dressed in a sharp, intimidating dark suit, holding a thick stack of federal arrest warrants tightly in his hand. I was flanked by no less than 50 fully armed, highly trained federal agents who immediately fanned out across the perimeter of the ballroom, aggressively establishing absolute control over every single exit point. The sheer, overwhelming scale of the federal raid was a magnificent sight to behold. Mitchell raised his voice, a booming, deeply authoritative command that instantly demanded total obedience from the terrified crowd. He loudly announced that the building was officially locked down under federal authority, instructing every guest to remain exactly where they were and to keep their hands clearly visible. Maxwell Thorne watched the federal agents flood his glamorous venue with an expression of pure, unadulterated madness. The arrogant, untouchable boy genius of commercial real estate completely snapped. He violently shoved Cameron out of his way, sending my son stumbling hard against the crystal podium. Maxwell leaped off the side of the main stage, his expensive leather shoes slipping wildly against the polished hardwood floor as he scrambled desperately toward the darkened rear catering corridor. He honestly believed he could just abandon his sinking ship and slip away into the shadows while his wealthy guests took the brunt of the federal chaos. I watched him run with the pathetic, frantic energy of a cornered rat. He aggressively shoved a terrified waiter out of his path, sprinting blindly toward the heavy swinging doors of the hotel kitchen. But Mitchell Crawford had anticipated every single possible escape route. As Maxwell violently burst through the wooden swinging doors, 3 massive federal agents stepped out from the shadows of the catering hallway to block his path. Maxwell tried to pivot wildly, searching for another way out, but his momentum carried him entirely too far forward. The lead agent did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. He lunged forward, hitting the young chief executive with a devastating, beautifully executed tactical tackle. The sheer force of the impact lifted Maxwell completely off the ground. He flew backward, crashing violently through a long, beautifully decorated catering table. Hundreds of expensive crystal champagne flutes, silver serving trays, and exquisite floral arrangements shattered explosively into the air, raining down over his custom-tailored Italian suit in a spectacular shower of broken glass and cold water. Maxwell hit the hard tile floor with a sickening thud, groaning in absolute agony as the wind was entirely knocked out of his lungs. The federal agents immediately descended upon him forcefully, rolling him onto his stomach and aggressively pinning his arms behind his back. The distinct, incredibly sharp, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs, ratcheting tightly around his wrists, echoed perfectly over the chaotic noise of the ballroom. The chief executive was now absolutely nothing but a broken, bleeding criminal pinned to the floor in a puddle of spilled champagne. Cameron remained stranded on the main stage, his entire body trembling violently as he witnessed the brutal, humiliating takedown of his powerful boss. He looked around the massive room, his terrified eyes desperately searching the sea of federal agents and panicked investors until they finally locked directly onto my face. The absolute reality of his impending federal prison sentence finally crushed the last remaining fragments of his arrogant delusion. He jumped awkwardly off the edge of the stage, stumbling over the broken glass as he sprinted frantically in my direction. He completely ignored the federal agents moving swiftly to secure the room, entirely focused on reaching me before the handcuffs could be placed on his own wrists. He crashed into me desperately, grabbing the lapels of my pristine tuxedo jacket with his sweaty, trembling hands. He began sobbing wildly, a pathetic, high-pitched wailing that sounded absolutely nothing like the confident vice president he had pretended to be. "Dad, you have to tell them it is a terrible mistake." Cameron choked out tears and sweat streaming down his pale face. "Tell them you authorized the wire transfer. You are my father. You have to save me." I stood perfectly still, letting his desperate, filthy hands grip my clothing. I looked down at the man I had sacrificed my entire life to raise, feeling absolutely no pity, no sorrow, and no paternal obligation. The warm, beating heart of a loving father had been completely replaced by ice-cold, unforgiving reality. I gently but firmly peeled his shaking hands off my jacket, pushing him slightly backward. "I am just a clueless, slowing old man who missed a simple scheduling email at 4:30 in the morning," I whispered softly, making sure he heard every single damning word. "How could I possibly save a brilliant executive like you?" Cameron collapsed completely onto the floor of the stage, his body shaking with violent, uncontrollable sobs as the horrifying gravity of his situation finally crushed his spirit. Just then, a piercing, hysterical scream ripped through the chaotic noise of the ballroom. Brooke pushed her way frantically through the dense crowd of terrified guests, her expensive designer gown catching and tearing on the jagged edges of a shattered crystal centerpiece. She scrambled up the short steps to the stage, her face a complete mess of running mascara and panicked tears. She threw herself onto her knees next to her husband, aggressively grabbing his shoulder and screaming at him to do something to fix the massive mistake before they lost their brand new yacht and their beautiful summer home. But Cameron could not even look at her. He simply kept his face buried deep in his hands, completely paralyzed by the overwhelming presence of the armed federal agents surrounding them. A tall, incredibly stern female investigator from the Federal Bureau stepped forward, her dark tactical windbreaker rustling sharply as she approached the sobbing couple. Brooke immediately looked up at the agent, raising her trembling hands in a desperate, pathetic gesture of total innocence. She began speaking incredibly fast, claiming she had absolutely no idea what her husband was doing, that she was just a dedicated wife, and that her personal accounts should be entirely protected from the corporate raid. The agent looked down at her with an expression of pure, unadulterated ice. She pulled a thick, official legal document from her jacket pocket and held it out. The agent informed Brooke in a voice entirely devoid of any sympathy that every single offshore shell account registered under her maiden name had already been completely frozen by the federal government 48 hours ago. Furthermore, the massive $2.5 million Hamptons estate she had just purchased had been officially seized under the Federal Asset Forfeiture Act, as it was bought entirely with stolen, laundered money. Brooke stared at the federal agent in absolute mind-numbing shock. The agent coldly explained that she was currently holding a zero balance across all her financial portfolios. Brooke was left utterly and completely penniless, stripped of the unearned luxury she had so aggressively flaunted, and suddenly facing the terrifying reality of becoming a convicted co-conspirator in a highly illegal massive international embezzlement scheme. I slowly turned my attention away from the pathetic display on the main stage and walked with calm, measured steps toward the shattered remains of the grand catering display. The beautiful hardwood floor was completely covered in a treacherous layer of broken glass, crushed flowers, and spilled sticky champagne. I carefully navigated through the wreckage until I stood directly over the ruined, groaning form of Maxwell Thorne. The once untouchable, wildly arrogant chief executive officer of Nexus Holdings was currently pinned firmly to the ground by two massive federal agents. His custom-tailored, incredibly expensive Italian suit was soaked with cold water and ripped heavily at the shoulder. A thin, dark line of blood trickled slowly from a fresh cut on his forehead, staining his pale, sweating cheek. The heavy steel handcuffs binding his wrists behind his back glinted sharply in the dim, chaotic light of the ballroom. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of absolute terror, agonizing physical pain, and the crushing, inescapable realization of his own utter failure. I looked down at the boy who had so foolishly believed he could steal my identity, destroy my 40-year corporate legacy, and lock me away in a maximum security federal penitentiary to rot and die. He had desperately tried to bury me to hide his own unforgivable greed, entirely underestimating the immense strength and ruthless strategic patience of the very man he was trying to destroy. I slowly knelt down carefully, avoiding the jagged shards of broken crystal scattered across the floor, until my face was merely inches away from his bleeding, trembling profile. The loud, frantic shouting of the surrounding federal raid seemed to instantly fade into the background, leaving only the harsh, ragged sound of his panicked breathing between us. I stared directly into the depths of his terrified eyes, ensuring he could see the absolute, terrifying finality of his profound defeat reflecting clearly in my steady gaze. I kept my voice incredibly low, delivering my final judgment with the lethal, calculating precision of a seasoned predator. "You fired me for being exactly 5 minutes late to a meaningless morning meeting," I whispered slowly, letting every single syllable sink deeply into his shattered mind. "You threw me out into the cold street and tried to completely erase my entire existence for your own selfish gain." I paused for a fraction of a second, watching a fresh tear of pure despair roll silently down his bruised face. I smiled, feeling the immense weight of the last 6 months finally lift from my aging shoulders. "I just fired you from your own life," I told him, my voice completely devoid of any mercy. "Enjoy the rest of your pathetic existence in a small concrete federal cell, Maxwell." I slowly stood back up to my full height, smoothing out the lapels of my pristine tuxedo jacket, and calmly turned my back on him, finally leaving him entirely to his well-deserved, inescapable, dark criminal fate forever. The federal agents aggressively hauled Maxwell and Cameron onto their feet, violently marching them through the grand lobby of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in heavy steel handcuffs. The aggressive financial press captured every single agonizing second of their highly publicized, utterly humiliating perp walk, broadcasting the devastating corporate downfall live across the entire globe. As the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers finally disappeared down the dark street, the immediate, catastrophic financial fallout violently began. In the chaotic after-hours trading markets, the stock price of Nexus Holdings plummeted incredibly fast, hitting absolute zero within minutes, as panicked investors frantically abandoned the deeply fraudulent company. The two villains who had tried to utterly destroy my existence were now entirely ruined, facing decades in federal prison with absolutely no hope of escape. I stood quietly on the freezing pavement next to Kenji Tanaka and Mitchell Crawford, taking a deep, satisfying breath of the crisp night air. I had successfully defended my honor, completely dismantled their stolen empire, and achieved total devastating justice against my own traitorous flesh and blood. But as I looked back up at the towering dark glass facade of the massive corporate skyscraper, I had spent 40 grueling years helping to build a heavy, lingering question remained deeply anchored in my mind. The ruthless architects of this massive deception had been permanently removed, but the sprawling, powerful company itself was now a completely shattered empty shell, waiting to be mercilessly scavenged by ruthless, highly opportunistic Wall Street financial predators. I stood alone in the cold shadow of the massive building, realizing my long, difficult battle was not entirely over yet. I now had to thoughtfully decide exactly what I was going to do with the scattered, burning ashes of my massive 40-year corporate legacy. The spectacular and highly publicized downfall of Maxwell Thorne sent an immediate catastrophic shockwave through the global financial sector. Within 48 hours of the federal raid at the Ritz-Carlton, the highly anticipated initial public offering of Nexus Holdings was completely canceled by the Securities and Exchange Commission. The media scrutiny was absolutely relentless. Financial news networks ran continuous coverage of the massive embezzlement scheme, gleefully dissecting how the boy genius of commercial real estate attempted to steal $50 million from a prominent international syndicate. The resulting panic among remaining corporate investors was swift and entirely merciless. Desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive scandal, major shareholders began liquidating their positions at massive losses. The company's stock completely collapsed into absolute worthlessness. Just 3 short months after that chaotic night in the Grand Ballroom, the board of directors had no choice but to formally file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The sprawling corporate empire I spent 40 grueling years helping to construct was completely dismantled and stripped down to its bare foundations. The corrupt, spineless board members who silently watched Maxwell fire me without a single word of protest were all unceremoniously ousted by the federal bankruptcy court. Their lucrative severance packages were entirely voided, leaving them with nothing but ruined professional reputations. The remaining viable assets of Nexus Holdings, including the downtown Chicago skyscraper and a lucrative portfolio of commercial properties across the Midwest, were promptly scheduled to be sold off in a highly regulated federal fire sale auction to compensate the deeply defrauded investors. I watched the rapid, systemic destruction of the company from the quiet comfort of my new apartment, reading daily financial reports with a profound sense of detached satisfaction. The towering corporate giant had been thoroughly gutted, reduced to a scattered collection of discounted physical assets and deeply tarnished brand equity. Wall Street predators began circling the wreckage, immediately eager to scavenge the prime real estate for pennies on the dollar. They viewed the bankrupt company as a tragic cautionary tale of unchecked corporate greed. However, while the rest of the financial world saw only a toxic, ruined wasteland of shattered investments, I saw something entirely different. I saw a rare, unprecedented opportunity to completely reclaim the house I built and meticulously cleanse it of the rot that infected its foundation. I picked up my secure phone and scheduled another deeply confidential meeting with Kenji Tanaka. Kenji had returned to Tokyo immediately following the federal raid, deeply satisfied with the swift, absolute justice we had served. When I proposed my radical new business strategy to him over the encrypted connection, he listened in silence before letting out a rare, genuine laugh of pure admiration. I did not just want to watch Nexus Holdings burn to the ground. I wanted to buy the entire company back from the federal bankruptcy court at a massive fraction of its original market value. Kenji enthusiastically agreed to provide the immense institutional capital required to fund the hostile takeover, fully recognizing the incredible financial potential of acquiring prime commercial real estate without the toxic burden of the corrupt former executive board. On the crisp, clear morning of the federal auction, I walked into the crowded downtown courthouse flanked by my oldest friend Mitchell Crawford and a team of elite corporate attorneys. The room was filled with aggressive hedge fund managers and rival real estate developers, all eager to pick the bones of my former employer clean. When the bidding for the primary holding company officially opened, I did not hesitate. We submitted a massive, overwhelming cash offer that instantly silenced the entire room. backed by the limitless resources of the Tokyo Syndicate. No other financial institution could even come close to matching our aggressive bid. With a single decisive strike of the auctioneer's gavel, the shattered remains of Nexus Holdings officially became my absolute uncontested property. I had successfully bought back the entire sprawling empire for literal pennies on the dollar. 1 week later, I walked through the grand glass doors of the towering Chicago skyscraper, not as a discarded senior executive, but as the sole absolute owner and chief executive officer of the entire organization. The building was eerily quiet, the luxurious lobby completely stripped of the pretentious modern art Maxwell had installed. I stepped into the private executive elevator and rode it all the way up to the 42nd floor. I walked directly into the massive corner office that had once belonged to the man who tried to destroy my life. I stood behind the heavy mahogany desk, looking out over the sprawling city skyline, feeling an incredible, overwhelming sense of total vindication. My very first official act as the new chief executive was not to hire expensive new management. Instead, I spent the entire afternoon personally calling dozens of loyal, hardworking older employees who had been unjustly terminated by Maxwell and Cameron over the past 2 years. I offered every single one of them their original jobs back, complete with full benefits, restored pensions, and a sincere personal apology for the terrible way they had been treated. I was determined to rebuild the company culture from the ground up, entirely rooted in the fundamental principles of absolute integrity. Deep mutual respect and unwavering loyalty to the people who actually did the hard work. A few days into my new tenure, I was sitting quietly at my massive mahogany desk, carefully reviewing a stack of fresh commercial contracts. The heavy oak door of my office opened softly, and my newly reinstated executive assistant stepped into the room. She carried a familiar thick silver tray holding my morning coffee, but right next to the steaming porcelain cup rested a single crumpled white envelope. She placed the tray gently on the edge of my desk, her expression incredibly tight and visibly uncomfortable. She told me the letter had just arrived in the morning mail, forwarded directly from a maximum security federal penitentiary located in upstate New York. I waited until she quietly exited the room before reaching out to pick up the cheap, incredibly thin paper envelope. The return address printed in the upper left corner bore the distinct sterile identification number of a federal inmate. My chest tightened slightly as I recognized the familiar slanted handwriting of my own son. I carefully slid a metal letter opener across the top fold and pulled out a single sheet of lined notebook paper. The letter was frantic, messy, and heavily stained with what appeared to be dried tears. Cameron wrote pages of desperate, pathetic apologies, begging me to forgive his terrible mistakes and pleading for another chance to be a real family. He described the brutal, terrifying reality of his new life behind bars, complaining bitterly about the cold food, the violent inmates, and the constant suffocating fear. At the very bottom of the page, hidden beneath all the manufactured remorse and empty promises, was the true purpose of his correspondence. He was begging me to deposit money into his federal commissary account so he could buy basic human comforts. I sat there in the total silence of my massive corner office, staring blindly at the desperate, pathetic pleas of the boy I had sacrificed absolutely everything to protect. I ran my fingers slowly over the creased, heavily stained paper, tracing the familiar loops of the handwriting belonging to the boy I had raised. A sudden deep flicker of profound sadness crossed my aging face as a flood of distant memories briefly washed over my mind. I remembered teaching Cameron how to ride his first bicycle in our quiet suburban neighborhood. I remembered the fierce, swelling pride I felt watching him receive his expensive Ivy League diploma. But those warm, nostalgic memories were violently interrupted by the cold, inescapable reality of what he had become. I forced myself to vividly remember the exact moment I sat in Mitchell's freezing car, staring at the digital ledger that proved my own son had maliciously stolen my signature to facilitate a $50 million embezzlement scheme. I remembered the sickening internal memo detailing his enthusiastic plan to tip off the federal authorities and frame a 74-year-old man to die alone in a maximum security penitentiary. A simple biological connection does not magically excuse an act of absolute calculated evil. Blood does not grant a free pass for a betrayal of that monumental magnitude. I carefully folded the tear-stained letter back into its original creases, refusing to read another pathetic, manipulative word. I slowly stood up from my heavy mahogany desk and walked deliberately across the plush carpet toward the heavy-duty industrial paper shredder sitting quietly in the corner of my office. I switched the machine on, listening to the low, aggressive hum of the steel blades spinning to life. Without a single moment of hesitation, I fed the desperate letter directly into the narrow metal slot, watching closely with a cold, unyielding resolve as his empty apologies were systematically destroyed and permanently erased from my life forever. I turned away from the shredder and walked slowly toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows lining the edge of my corner office. I stood quietly, looking out over the sprawling, beautiful Chicago skyline, as the bright afternoon sun cast a warm golden glow across the towering glass buildings. Standing there, at the absolute pinnacle of the corporate world, I felt the comforting, familiar presence of my late wife, Beatrice, standing softly right beside me. I knew in my heart she would be incredibly proud that I did not simply let pure greed and unchecked evil win, even when that evil arrived in the form of our own son. I reclaimed my dignity, but I wanted to ensure no one else suffered my terrible fate. I established the Beatrice Barrett Legal Fund, a massive multi-million-dollar charitable initiative strictly dedicated to defending elderly corporate workers from wrongful termination and systemic financial abuse. I used my reclaimed fortune to hire an army of elite attorneys to fight for the men and women who had spent their entire lives building companies only to be tossed aside. I had finally transformed my deepest pain into a permanent, unbreakable shield for the most vulnerable. Age is not a weakness. It is an impenetrable fortress built on decades of survival. Never underestimate the people who laid the bricks you stand on. In a corporate world obsessed with youth and ruthless ambition, loyalty is often discarded for the quick payout. But greed leaves a sloppy trail, and arrogance breeds fatal carelessness. If you ever find yourself holding the knife to stab someone in the back, remember this. The person you are betraying might just be the architect of the very system you are trying to manipulate. True power does not scream, it waits, watches, and strikes. Have you been betrayed by someone you trusted with your livelihood or your life? How did you fight? Drop your story in the comments below. I read every single one. Do not forget to like this video and subscribe for more life stories. Stay sharp and watch your back.